So good afternoon, folks. I'm going to kick us off. Welcome to today's webinar, The Collaboration Spectrum Revisited. All right, I want to invite all of us to just take a deep breath and take a moment to really ground in the land that you are finding yourself in this afternoon. And I want to invite you to join me in acknowledging with gratitude, the generations of Indigenous people who have taken care of the land. And we believe that this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous people must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in all of our communities. If you know the land that you are joining us from, I'd also encourage you to put that into the chat box so you have a sense of who all is here and joining us today. It's my privilege to introduce us as well. So many of you know Liz Weaver. Liz is the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, where she's leading our Tamarack Learning Center, which is really focused on advancing community change leadership. Liz is a renowned thought leader and has written many papers, including just published this year, a paper called, the same as our webinar, The Collaboration Spectrum Revisited. And I'm pointing that one out in particular because I know after our conversation and exploration today, if you have other thoughts, ideas, and want to go deeper into some of what we're talking about, I'd encourage you to look at that in particular. And I am Sylvia Cheuy, and I'm the Consulting Director of Collective Impact, also with the Tamarack Institute. And we're thrilled to have so many of you with us on the line. So we want to kick this off with a bit of a poll and ask each one of you if you could take a moment and respond, kind of self-assessing your level of experience in working collaboratively. We're at 75%. Let's give it a few more minutes and see how we do. If we can hit, can we hit 100%? We're at 90 now. Beautiful. Okay, Jamie, can I call on you maybe to, you've already shared the results, or can you? Beautiful. Take a look, folks. Overwhelmingly, 70% of us are considering ourselves to be intermediate. We've got a smaller percentage of beginners and a smaller percentage of experts. So encourage you also to think about in our chat box and questions if there are insights and advice you want to share or questions as well. All are welcome. All right, thanks. Can we go to the next slide? So I want to start by anchoring us in this conversation of collaboration and set the stage by really emphasizing some really key points. One of the things I really love about the collaboration spectrum, which is something we'll display and walk through in a little more detail on the next slide, is that it really helps all of us to appreciate that collaboration isn't just one thing. And it's actually in our spectrum, there are 7 different possibilities around collaboration and collaboration strategies. And that's why it's really important in any collaborative work that you're doing to make sure that everyone around the table has a shared sense of the level of collaboration that we are wanting to try and achieve or we think is necessary to advance our work. The other key element here is that just because you start on one place on the continuum of collaboration doesn't mean that you won't evolve or move from one dimension to another over time. And I think in parallel with that, I think the other thing to remember is one of these elements on the spectrum of collaboration is not necessarily better or worse than any other. It really is about, choosing the right dimension based on sort of readiness and experience and what it is you're trying to achieve. And obviously perceptions of turf and also the need and growing levels of trust also have an impact on where you might want to focus your initial work from a collaborative perspective. So if you can jump to the next slide, I think this is, we've touched on many of these elements right here. But if you take a look, one of the other things I love about this spectrum is really that there's an explicit acknowledgement of competition, because I think that that is a real element in this work of community change. And I think it's an important consideration because it affects, obviously, in particular, the capacity for trust, right? And willingness to trust, quite frankly, as well as how we might perceive turf. And I think one of the things, if we go to the next slide, that we have found extremely useful in helping to facilitate a shared understanding of collaboration when bringing groups together is to do this simple exercise where we look at the spectrum of options around collaboration and give each participant 2 dots. The first dot, we ask them, put a dot on the dimension of collaboration that you think currently exists amongst us and the work we're doing. And then sometimes we add a second dot around thinking about the work ahead and what we want to achieve together. Put a dot where you think we need to get to in order to be successful in that work. And what's really useful and helpful is both of those dots, clustering of dots, actually can generate some really rich conversation. So, for example, if we were going to look at, the placing of the blue dots, it would be really interesting to explore, particularly for the person who's kind of identified coexisting, what is it that led you to sort of put yourself there as opposed to elsewhere on the continuum? Because what we often discover is it might actually be that that person's sort of newer to the collaboration and may not fully appreciate all the dimensions and or other components of the collaboration's journey. So a great opportunity to help kind of fill those gaps. Also, just looking at core, if you look at the final dot on the right around coordination, what is it you're seeing that helps you to really appreciate that we're moving in toward that place? Can have rich conversations between the dots. What would it take for us to move from where we're generally clustered today to where we think we need to be to advance work? What would help us get there? So there's lots of opportunity to explore and just acknowledge that we are in different places in our understanding, and it's important that we get on the same page. So anything you'd add to that, Liz, before we jump to the poll?
I think you did a great job of explaining it. I think it is always interesting conversations, particularly when everybody around the table thinks that they're all working in a collaborative way, but they come with very different orientations. And, I think it's also not just a one-time activity. If you're seeing a lot of shifting and changing around your collaborative table, you might bring this exercise back a second time to assess, where are we now, or what are your expectations about the collaborative experience that we're going to be in together? And so, yeah, it's a great tool. We've certainly facilitated it lots of times and had some very interesting conversations with groups. Sylvia, I don't know if you recall when we were both in Red Deer and we had 7 different collaboratives in the room, and asked them to go through this exercise. And then 2 years later, we met with them and we asked them to do the exercise again. And some of the groups moved forward, some of the groups stayed the same, and some of the groups moved backwards. And this is, normal for collaborative experiences, because some people, have momentum and keep moving forward. Others, are perfectly happy where they are. Maybe they were there to communicate and they're doing a really good job of sharing resources and communicating. And others might have lost funding or lost people or lost some of that momentum and found themselves, maybe they were coordinating action and then, they landed on communicating just because of some of those big shifts that have happened to them in their community. So again, a really interesting opportunity to have really interesting conversations with members of the collaborative table.
And what you've really highlighted as well is what a great evaluation tool, right, as well. Because if you did it at the outset and you had a bit of a baseline, and then you ask people, where are we now 2 years later? Not only from that conversation can you identify what were the things that really helped solidify our capacity around collaboration, what were the things that got in the way, right? Beautiful. All right.
Exactly. So I'll move us on to the next slide.
Absolutely. This is our second poll. And so we're asking you, when you think about those 7 dimensions on the collaboration spectrum, where would you say the work that you're working on sits on that spectrum? I really love watching kind of the difference, the varying perspectives and assessments here. Just a few more seconds there. See if we can get to the results. Have you, there we go. So how about, we're at 84%. Can everyone see them, Jamie? Or do you want to broadcast them for people to see?
People should be able to see.
Beautiful. So I think for me, given the conversation that we just had, one thing I'd invite everyone to reflect on is, as you think about the mandate of your collaborative work, where would you love to see yourself be, or what level of collaboration do you think would be necessary for you to accomplish some of the goals that you're hoping to accomplish, and really start thinking about what are some of the questions you might have around what would it take, or, what are some of the actions that you think might help you move along. All right. So I think this is where I turn it over to you, right, Liz?
Yep. Thanks, Sylvia. So Sylvia set the context in terms of really understanding the collaboration spectrum. It's been a tool that we really like at Tamarack, that we use often, and that we find is a really great grounding tool for collaborative work. And it was interesting to see where you all landed. I mean, there was more of that bump in the middle around, coordinate and collaborate, and at the two ends, competition and integration, a little bit less of you showed up. And it's very interesting. I was on a call earlier today, and we were talking about the collaboration spectrum with peace building organizations, and they asked about the competition part of the spectrum. And I said, for those of us that work in the voluntary or community-based sector, we sometimes are afraid of competition, right? And yet, if we think about the private sector, competition is what advances things in the private sector. And in fact, in the voluntary sector and in the community sector, competition does advance our work. And so we need not shy away from it. I think we need to embrace it, right? That would be my take on that. And that's why I think it's a really important part of the collaboration spectrum. So we're now going to kind of pivot to some of the newer thinking that we've had at Tamarack, as Sylvia has said. And what we're doing, this is prototyping thinking, right? So we've put some stuff out there, and we really would benefit from your experiences and your reflections, right, on all of this. And so, we published an article, but we think we got it roughly right. And we know that your experiences are all rich. And so how can we benefit? And so part of the reason why we thought we would do this webinar is to invite some of your wisdom into the room and help us kind of co-create this even further. So you might think that there are additional points on the collaboration spectrum. I've been thinking about collective action and whether we should add collective action to the collaboration spectrum, not collective impact, but collective action. And so I'm, got these ideas rolling around in my head. I would really appreciate, hearing from you as well as from your ideas. So just to set a little bit more of the thinking, I had some conversations recently with folks who were thinking about collaborative governance. And I started to roll around in my head 3 C's that I think really impact the collaboration spectrum and really help inform and help support more effective collective action or collaborative work. And the first is the degree to which we understand our local community context. And so some of the questions that raised up for me when I was thinking about, okay, if I'm wanting to move work forward in my community, whether it's my neighborhood, my city, my region, my province, my state, my country, whatever scale we're working at, what are the things that I need to pay attention to about my local context? And these are the questions that I have put together as a jumping off point, and we'd love to get your questions in the chat box to add to the list, but these were questions for me that were really important. So the first question is there energy? Is anybody leaning into this issue? Or are people saying, hey, we got too much going on? Oh my God, I can't even think of one more thing, please go away. And if people are leaning in, that's a signal of energy. And under a collective impact context, they call it urgency of the issue. But I think it's really important to kind of consider that. The other thing is who's already doing the work. And we know, I remember Faye Henley Brown, who is with the Collective Impact Forum and FSG. She was talking about a community, which was a medium-sized community of about 85,000 people. And they were looking at youth-supported activities in that community. And they were able to identify over 400 different types of youth-supported activities in a community of about 85,000. So there's a lot of energy already there, and there are a lot of people already working on it. And so if you're thinking about collaboration, how does what you're trying to do sit within who's already working on this issue? And Sylvia, you probably have a really good story to tell about the work you've done in Caledon called Mapping Moving Trains, which I'll turn to in a second. How many collaborative tables are already underway? Who's going to convene this? Who's going to step up to the plate and show some of that initial convening leadership? And then what other questions do I have? Sylvia, do you want to share what you learned when you did the Mapping Moving Trains exercise in Caledon?
Yeah, I think, well, first I should back up and say I really borrowed this framework from the folks at the Forum for Youth Investment, because they were raising the same issue, which I'm actually seeing in the chat box as well. There are so many existing collaboratives now. And so how do we navigate that? And this framework is really designed to kind of do some surveying of those individual collaboratives and compile that information and share it as everyone comes into the room, because we don't see, right? We often have our heads down doing our own work, and we miss all kinds of opportunities, and or we make our own work needlessly difficult by thinking we have to be the ones to lead it. So I modified that, and I did that work with some community agencies all in the Caledon area, which happens to be home for me. And it was so illuminating for people, and they were so appreciative of actually being able to see synergies that existed between them or didn't, but should. And so it was a really practical way to give folks some early wins and or to get them thinking strategically about when and where collaboration might make a lot of sense. And I also remember seeing this done by the folks at Forum for Youth Investment initially in the Waterloo region. And the thing I will never forget was in the surveying and the presenting back of the data, they had 17 different collaborative tables, all working on some dimension of support to children and youth in the region. And I remember the folks at FYI saying, you Canadians, you are so polite. If there were 17 of you running around these different collaborative meetings, like when does somebody stand up and say, should we be looking at maybe collapsing and collaborating a little bit more, because we're wasting all kinds of time and we could be much more efficient and effective by bringing a collaboration of collaborations together where it makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, a really great point, Sylvia. And I think sometimes we dive into the work, or a funder has asked us to do work in a collaborative way, or our orientation is to work with other people. community context is critical, right? Particularly when we're thinking about collaboration and when there's multiple organizations, programs, and services that are in the area. I think what I liked about the mapping moving trains exercise when you shared the Caledon experience was when I read through it, there were people that were delivering, organizations that were delivering services, but there were gaps, right? And so that helped illustrate some of the gaps and probably led to a really interesting conversation about maybe we don't need two of our programs over here doing the same thing. And that frees up one of our programs to support something over here, right? So again, a really interesting way of thinking how context, understanding your local context can really make a difference.
And the other thing I saw is where those gaps were revealed, because everyone was in the same room and could see it in totality, it also invited really interesting conversations about, do we collaboratively explore how we might fill that gap? Which, if you think in terms of the collaboration spectrum, means we are, maybe not at a higher level of collaboration. We're focusing exclusively on a very discrete program or issue. But it actually creates the trust, I think, sometimes that's necessary to shift the context more broadly, right?
Yeah, and I think, the other thing that I would say is that it also helps us understand, who's doing what is the story that we're telling each other, and then what might be the story that we communicate up to funders about the next piece of work that is ahead of us. So has many of those splash and ripple effects. And, at Tamarack, I think we really believe in the notion of conversation, and these questions are conversation starters, or the collaboration spectrum itself is a conversation starter. So the next piece around collaboration that we think is a good kind of entry point is this notion of clarity of purpose. And so often we dive into the work of collaboration. And, Sylvia might invite me to the table. And because I know Sylvia and I like her, I show up for the first collaborative meeting and I actually don't know what we're all about, right? And so we do think about, this again as a critical conversation and a critical part of collaboration. Where are we on the spectrum? But what is it that we're aiming to do together? In the collective impact context, they call it common agenda, which I think is a really nice and has really led us into some great thinking about this. But again, clarity of purpose includes things like, what are we going to do together? But what expectations do we have about how we're going to work with each other and how we're going to engage with this work? If we're expecting people to show up, are we also expecting their organizations to show up? And are we looking at this work as also transforming them and their organizations? And so what are those kind of sometimes implied expectations that we have about one another? And what are those more, how can we make them more explicit? Anything for you, Sylvia, that shows up on clarity of purpose?
I think asking that question and revisiting the question of purpose can also be a catalyst for moving more intentionally into a more focused level of collaboration. And I'm thinking about the early days of the Headwaters Communities in Action project that I was part of. And for many years, there had been like a network that met monthly just to trade information, right? And the local hospital CEO stood up one day and said, I find these meetings useful, but not of very much use. Like, when are we as a community going to gather around and create a shared vision for what we think our community ought to be, and then start working together to make it happen? So that was a real invitation, I think, for people to revisit purpose and really re-clarify where we want to go together.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sylvia. And then the final one, and I think this is sometimes one we jump over, but I think it's so important, particularly in a collaborative context. Doesn't matter where you sit in the spectrum, you still need to do this work. What is the container in which this work is going to happen, right? So what's inside the container, and then what exists outside of the container? And this is so important because it helps you say, okay, we're going to work on this together. And yes, other opportunities will show up, but we're always going to judge it against what we say is in our container, right? Is it actually helping us move our collaborative work forward, or is it a distraction to us? And, I use the phrase a lot, death by 1,000 opportunities, right? Because once you start collaborating, people go, oh, there's a collaborative table. Let's get them to do this, or let's give that opportunity to them. And your table can be easily distracted. And so here are some things that you want to think about from a container kind of perspective. What's the definition of the problem? So how are we defining it? If we're, working on homelessness, how are we defining it? Is it homelessness for everyone? Or is it young people that are experiencing homelessness and couch surfing? Or is it seniors? So how do we define it? Because our strategies might be particular to different demographic groups and to different kinds of priorities. What are the values and the principles that really govern our work? And so I share often the story that a collaborative I led in Hamilton, one of our values was that we were a no blame, all accountable table. So we weren't there to blame, people, or to blame government, or to blame the business leaders or the voluntary sector leaders, but we were going to ask really hard questions, right? So no blame, all accountable was a core value. And then when someone started to go down the blame road, our chair would say, hey, we're a no blame, all accountable table. So that person kept us on track. What's the geographic scope that we're working in? What are the financial resources and the human resources that are available to support this work? Are there timelines? Like, are we working in a 1-year time frame, a 5-year time frame? Or do we think this is going to take 2 or 3 or 8 generations, right? 7 generations. What's the time frame, and how does that influence the scope and the scale of our work? What are our success factors? What does success look like for us? Not only in the first year, but years 2, years 3, a generation from now. So Sylvia, anything else you would add to this list?
I just want to emphasize, I love that the comprehensiveness of the bullets here. And the one that really caught my eye was the financial and human resources one, for 2 reasons. One, I've often seen a funder putting out an opportunity, right? And so there's this opportunity that requires collaboration, and you see a number of partners not deeply, deeply invested in their collaboration, but using that as the magnet to actually kind of begin exploring that, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But in the spirit of death by 1,000 opportunities, I've also seen the danger of, oh, look, we can chase this, and then we can chase that. And so for me, I think the other bullets of the container that you've identified here really help. Don't eliminate the reality of that happening, but certainly solidify and help inoculate against the worst of what that is.
Yeah, thanks for that. So these are, no matter where you sit on the spectrum, these are almost like things you should think about to build even more success in your collaboration from stage 1. Or if you're further along the collaboration road, you've been at it for a couple of years, you're in the intermediary or more senior experience part of the spectrum, you can stop and pause and say, hey, to what degree have we paid attention to the container? To what degree are we thinking about our purpose? Or to what degree are we thinking about the context of our community, and what has shifted in the last little while that helps us revisit that? So in using those as kind of the table settings, now we're talking about the collaboration spectrum revisited. And so I was thinking, hey, we've used the collaboration spectrum tool for about 10 years. Could we do a 2.0 or 3.0 upgrade on the tool? And, what would that look like? And so we started to play around with concepts around defining elements, right? So in the spectrum, you can see each of these is defined in one way or another, right? So competition, compete is competition for clients, resources, partners, public attention, etc. So you can see that. So there's a definition already embedded in the spectrum. But what forms of collaboration fit under each of those areas? Because there are a ton of forms out there. There's public-private partnerships, there's coalitions, there's collective impact work. I'm sure if I were to poll everybody in the room, you would have a form of collaboration that we could add to this list. And so what are typical forms and where do they sit on the collaboration spectrum? Who convenes and what does convening look like under each of these conditions? And is there even convening leadership? Where does authority lie within each of these elements of collaboration? Who owns it? So authority and ownership and convening leadership, they're all kind of connected together. So where does that sit? What are some of those key governance documents that can be really helpful? And what would outcomes look like? What would that success look like? And so what we did was start to kind of take these based on some conversations that we had with people that were practitioners of and supporters and conveners of collaboration to really start to play around with them. And the next couple of slides are slides you should never show when you're doing a presentation, but I'm going to show them because this is what it looks like. So in the paper, The Collaboration Spectrum Revisited, we started to take this and play around with the concepts and the different elements. And so you can see that, you know, if you're sitting, for example, on the coexist part of the collaboration spectrum, what you can see there is there's really not a lot of connection between organizations. Sometimes you're coexisting, but you're brought together by a single organization to at least recognize that you're all providing youth programming in the community or something like that. The authority sits within the individual organizations. There's probably not any governance documents, and probably it's way more ad hoc in terms of connections. And at least the outcome is we're at least aware of one another, like we're in the ecosystem providing programs. Another place on the spectrum might be cooperate. And so again, it's a little bit different, right? This is a more kind of connected form of collaboration. So there might be a convener of this work, and you might want to have terms of reference. You might want to have a shared action plan. You might want to articulate what success looks like. It could be that it's shorter term versus longer term. So we're going to cooperate on a project or a shared delivery of a service. And then once we get that project up and running, the other partners kind of flow away from the table. So again, here's some kind of high-level guidelines, and you may or you may disagree. You may agree or you may disagree. We'd love to know that. Collaborate's different, right? And so types of collaboration might be collective impact, might be mission-driven collaboration. And so it's longer term. And you can see that the density of convening leadership and authority and governance documents kind of shifts as we get further along the collaboration spectrum. And so each of these is different in form and substance and way of describing the experience for people, but it also gives us some guidelines or some things to think about if we see ourselves in that part of the collaboration spectrum. And it's also something I think we could take back to our collaborative tables and say, hey, is this roughly right? Or what would we add? What would we change? Sylvia, what do you think about, you know, this little dance that we've just done around the collaboration spectrum?
The one thing that I'm really excited about in particular is the unpacking of different types, right? Because it really helps you recognize that even within one particular dimension of the spectrum, there are multiple structures that might help you kind of get that work started. And the thing I remember was you a while ago, thinking from the lens of collective impact, had actually looked at 3 or 4 different options for how you can organize sort of the structure, and that there are pros and cons for each one. So for me, it's sort of, yeah, none of them are going to be perfect. but really go in with your eyes open around advantages, disadvantages. And then the second thing it really struck me, one of the comments in the chat box from Jennifer Yee, I think, Jennifer, just a minute. She actually also brought forward, it's Jane Yee, thinking about where does accountability sit? Authority is one thing, but maybe as an addition, we want to be thinking about what options do we have around shared accountability, mutual accountability to one another, that kind of thing. Great addition.
Or no accountability to one another. So that could be part of it as well. That's a really great thing, because authority is one thing, but yes, accountability is another. And sometimes, if you're a collective impact initiative and you're in collaborate or even integrate, because sometimes collective impact initiatives sit across those, you might have multiple layers of accountability, right? So depending on what you're doing around your collaborative table. So that's a puzzle to unpack, but a really interesting one to add in. So thanks for that. We'll maybe think a little bit further about that one, Sylvia, and figure out how to do an upgrade to this. One of the final things, and then we'll maybe open it up for comments and questions and a little bit of a deeper dive. One of the final things to think about is what are some of those core governance documents that can make the work happen a little bit more smoothly and seamlessly. And so we have 6 that we really like at Tamarack, and ones that we will often turn to. The first one is articulating what your structure looks like, right? So you can say, hey, we're a mission-driven collaborative, and this is what it looks like. This is and sometimes that shows up in a terms of reference, but I love visuals, right? And so what does it look like? Is it hierarchical? Is it horizontal? And if you link to this, you'll get a resource that will talk about different kinds of governance structures. Earlier in the webinar, I talked about the no blame, all accountable table. Well, how did we set up some of those core principles for working together? So important at the front end of collaboration, or at some point in your collaborative work, that you say, hey, we're going to treat each other with respect. We anticipate that everybody shows up authentically, whatever they are. What's really important to your collaborative work? How are you going to make decisions? Plans on a page. So, so often we go through these pretty in-depth planning processes. We always like to synthesize them into a 1-page document or a 2-page document to say, hey, this is what we're trying to accomplish together as one of those key documents. Milestone reports really track the decisions that you've made over time, and then regular and annual progress updates. And so these are kind of documents that, if you pay attention to them, will make your collaborative table more successful, but not all of them are required for all forms of collaboration. And so if you go back to the table, you can see that governance documents show up differently in each of these, right? So at compete and coexist, very lightweight or no weight, right through to integrate. And then you want to pay more attention to what kinds of documents will be helpful to you. So again, just another little bit of a thumbnail sketch for you. Hey, before we open it up for questions, we have one more poll. And so you were preempting this poll, Sylvia, at the beginning, but we want people to say, okay, so that collaborative that you are affiliated with, where do you hope to be in 2 years? Where do you want to take your collaborative? What's the opportunity for you? Seeing you pop in your answers.
And while we're waiting, one of the things I've really valued, Liz, in how you've really kind of teased out and offered much more clarity and consideration for each of the columns is, this makes the conversation around options much more tangible, much more real. Are we really ready for this level of commitment? Is this the level that is absolutely required for us to get things done? So I think it helps people make more informed decisions about wherever they choose to be.
Yeah, and I think, I think the intent was always to at least get people to talk about it, right? That's, I think when we develop tools at Tamarack, we're always thinking about how can this seed a conversation that might be helpful to people, right? And might create some of that intentionality. This is really interesting, right? The shape of the curve looks slightly different for where you want to be in 2 years' time. And, for those of you that stayed in the same place, that's okay, right? Like, we're not assuming, I think at Tamarack, that every collaborative moves to another spot. But we think what's I think more relevant and more important is that everybody agrees that that's the spot, and that's okay for us, right? And we're cool with that. Hey, so Sylvia or Jamie, what patterns are you seeing as you're looking in the chat box, and also maybe the questions that are coming forward?
Sure. In terms of so we'll see the poll, the final poll is shared there if anyone wants to take a look at that data. In terms of the questions that I'm seeing from the chat box, there were a lot of questions, which is great. One of them that I pulled is from Vina Katri, who's from Treaty 6 in Edmonton. They said, I have found the collaboration consistently challenging by the change in personnel from partner services, and will appreciate any insight on the role of backbone in onboarding. How can we do that better?
Sylvia, do you want to tackle that one?
One of the ones that really comes to mind for me is some of the tools that you referenced in the earlier slide, right? So taking the time to synthesize and document isn't just for external audiences like funders or the community. And I'm thinking about things like the plan on a page or the key milestone report in particular. Those are also really valuable tools for ongoing sustainability, onboarding new people, and frankly, even the collaboration spectrum. If you've done this as a baseline and you've made as a collaborative a decision to move yourselves along that continuum, why? What was it in your history that led you to assess that you needed to be in one place rather than another? So any of these tools and visuals not only help people to think together in the moment, but I also would encourage people to think about how might we use these tools to help onboard and give context to new folks coming on board. I hope
and I think, just building on that, I would, if I was supporting a collaborative, I would have an onboarding file, right? And these core documents, every time we upgrade them, I just put a version of it in the onboarding file. And then as people joined, that's the first thing that I would take to them and say, hey, here's the core documents for, our collaborative, and have a coffee with them and walk them through the documents, right? So often, we bring new people on and it's great that new people join, but we don't have the intentionality behind the onboarding process. And I think you're right. I think it is really important to think about, okay, so why did this person join us? What is it that will be a unique value that they bring? And then what is it that we can give them as a collaborative to help them, that can help them in their journey as a participant of this collaborative? So great question.
Thank you, Liz. So the next question is from Marcia Nation. It says, I'm new to the phrase collaborative table and I love it. Any background on why this phrase was chosen and what you mean by it?
That's a great question.
What would you say, Sylvia?
I think the thing that comes to mind for me is I always think of, the Knights of the Round Table, right? It's a very, hopefully, the visual that comes to mind is it's more equitable. And that for me, when you think about, a round table with different perspectives on it, that's another dimension, right? We all have our own vantage point on this issue. But that it's also, we are all sharing ownership and responsibility for imagining what else or what more we might do together, right? To address something that we all agree we care about.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. I think for me, it is this more equitable round table kind of process, right? That we are all part of the conversation and that we, are sharing ideas equally. And that, particularly in a collective impact context, when you're bringing in, people with lived and living experience, those context experts in that, we do need to have these processes that create the equity of voice and equity of perspective. One of the really interesting questions that we often use at Tamarack when new tables are being formed is, why is it important that you're here? Because we know that people have very busy lives. All of us have a million priorities, but people who show up in these collaborative tables show up for a reason, and inviting that reason into the room really helps enrich the experience of everybody around that table. And so why is it important that you're here? Every time I participate in that kind of conversation, I just love it, because it helps me really understand that it's both head, I believe in the cause, but it's also heart. Something about this cause spoke to me, and I want to lean into it in that way. And so it's just such a lovely question.
And before we move on, there was one thing in what you just said in your answer that I think really caught my attention. So I think having that table and, that is equitable, horizontal, equitable is critical. But I also, something in what you said reminded me, just because everybody's at the table doesn't do enough in terms of really fostering an environment of equity. It's a good start, but that doesn't mean that we at our table don't have to be really intentional about reinforcing that or supporting that beyond our, look, you've got a seat at the table just like everybody else.
Thanks for that. Oh,
over to you.
Okay, thank you for that. Sylvia Plant asked a question about context, and as we're thinking about collaboration in light of the pandemic, how do virtual settings of collaboration impact what is and can be done, and how it is and should be done?
Yeah, the pandemic and meeting much more virtually, it has really shifted a lot of our work, right? Certainly at Tamarack, we've experienced it, but we've also experienced it with our community tables where we've had to be creative about how to engage. And some of our tables are in rural and remote communities where bandwidth to join online might be more challenging as well. I think, part of some of the things that you could do in a virtual environment, because in a virtual environment, you still have to focus on some of those core dimensions of collaboration, trust building that we talked about, thinking about engagement, thinking about equity, those kinds of things. In a virtual environment, though, you can do things that are fun, right? So if everybody can't engage on a website because of bandwidth, how do we put people's pictures up for them, right? And so, that they can see each other if they're not able to turn their cameras on. So I am supporting some work in Indiana. And every time we gather together, one of the slides in the slide deck is a picture of everybody who's part of that design team. And when we do check-ins, we use that slide so that people, as they're checking in, we can see their faces, right? So you can do things that create connection. The questions like, why is it important that I'm here? Always having those kind of check-in questions, those connection questions as part of the collaboration is so important. Really be intentional about your agenda. When are the times that you have a whole of group conversation, and when are the times that you might have smaller conversations that really enable people to talk to peers or, have mixed conversations. And technology helps with that because we have Zoom rooms or smaller group rooms, but we need some supports for that to happen. But you can be really intentional in terms of setting those up. And then you can also, I think, in a virtual environment, connect one-on-one with people. And we probably do a lot less of that than we should, right? Is that one-on-one check-in and connection calls, because we're so busy and we have our heads down and we're answering a million emails and all the things that are in our lives. But how do we make the time for that to, check and see how people are doing, or the gratitude, or expressing gratitude. Another fun thing that we do is at the beginning of a meeting, often we'll do a temperature check. So people, it's a quick little icebreaker exercise where people can say, hey, I'm in the red zone right now, or I'm in the yellow zone, or I'm in the green zone. And understanding where people in the virtual room are right now helps you as the facilitator of the meeting to kind of think about, okay, how much can I push forward with this designed agenda, or how much do I have to pull back and say, hey, maybe this is a time where we spend more time just, checking in a little bit longer and creating some of that psychological safety that we need to create for groups. Sylvia, those are some of my ideas. What about you?
I've been thinking a lot about what have we been doing at Tamarack, because we've gone fully virtual. And I know we rely a lot on things like Mural, which is a whiteboard collaboration software that you can show in the same way that you would show a PowerPoint slide. I know others have used Google Jam, and there's lots of options. But it really reinforces again for me why the visual tools like a collaboration spectrum start to become even more important, because you can still put those up, and those are the visual anchors that help us all think together. I think they've always been there when we've been in the room, and we know how important they are to keeping us all in the same conversation and clear about how we're moving forward. But I also think we can bring them into a virtual environment, and helping us anchor in visuals to map how we're thinking together and what our decisions are, I think is invaluable.
Yeah. And the final piece I would say, Jamie, before I send it to you for wrap up, is that, tools are tools, right? And they are there to customize to your own purpose. So you might say, hey, I don't think competition fits on the collaboration spectrum, in my opinion, so I'm only going to use coexist to collaborate. That is okay, right? If that works in your context, then you can use that tool in your way. But recognize that, they are there for adaptation, right? And so, and I think it's the other piece of advice that I would have around any of this, and I know, Sylvia, you probably agree, is prototype, right? Bring something forward and learn from it. Maybe bring it to a smaller group of your collaborative table before you bring it to the whole collaborative table. Ask them some questions about it, prototype it, and then bring it into a larger group if you're feeling a little bit nervous about a tool or an approach. So thank you, everybody, on behalf of myself and Sylvia.